There are Bible passages sitting in plain sight that the church has quietly learned never to read out loud. They come right after Noah's flood. And what they actually say is so morally incoherent and internally contradictory that one man was excommunicated, nearly stabbed, and erased from his community for simply pointing them out. His name was Spinoza, and the punishment still stands. The flood narrative gets all the Sunday school attention. The ark, the animals, 2 by 2, the rainbow. But what happens immediately after Noah steps off that boat is so strange and morally troubling that the church has largely learned to just skip past it. Nearly 400 years ago, a Dutch lens grinder named Baruch Spinoza read these passages, saw exactly what was wrong, and paid for it with everything he had. Let's talk about what Genesis actually says after the waters recede, why it doesn't hold together, and why a philosopher's excommunication in 1656 still reverberates today. So the flood is over. God has just drowned virtually every living thing on earth because of humanity's wickedness. Noah, the one righteous man in all of creation, the man God hand-selected to preserve life itself, steps off the ark onto dry ground, according to Genesis, onto the mountains of Ararat. You'd expect what comes next to be a story of renewal, of a purified humanity starting fresh. What does the one righteous man on earth do? Genesis 9 verse 20 says, Noah began farming and planted a vineyard. Then he drank the wine, got drunk, and became uncovered in his tent. That's it. That's the first thing the Bible tells us Noah does after God entrusts him with the survival of the entire human race. He plants a vineyard, gets blackout drunk, and strips naked. This is the very first mention of wine anywhere in the Bible, and its inaugural appearance isn't in a scene of celebration or communion. It's a passed-out old man lying exposed in his tent. What happens next gets genuinely bizarre. Ham, one of Noah's 3 sons, walks into the tent and sees his father naked. The text says he saw the nakedness of his father and told his 2 brothers outside. That's it. That's all Ham does. He sees something he shouldn't have and tells his brothers. Shem and Japheth then walk in backwards, holding a garment between them, and cover Noah without looking at him. Noah wakes up, somehow knows what happened, and responds with a curse. But here's the thing that makes scholars scratch their heads to this day. He doesn't curse Ham. He curses Ham's son, Canaan, who wasn't even in the story. Genesis 9:25 says, Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be to his brothers. A grandfather, freshly hungover from a bender he brought entirely upon himself, curses his own grandson for something the grandson's father did. There's another detail that often gets glossed over in church. God is completely silent in this scene. God doesn't curse Canaan. God doesn't endorse Noah's words. Noah does this entirely on his own, and he does it while he's either still drunk or nursing the worst hangover in biblical history. Common experience tells us these are the words of someone not at his best. What's striking is that Noah had just received the Noahic covenant from God, the first covenant after the flood, establishing God's promise never to destroy the earth by flood again, marked by the rainbow. Yet immediately after this divine covenant, we get this morally chaotic scene. This passage, this incoherent, morally bankrupt little episode, became what scholar David Goldenberg called the single greatest justification for black slavery for more than 1,000 years. Pro-slavery preachers in antebellum America seized on the curse of Ham as divine sanction for enslaving African people, despite the fact that nowhere in Genesis is there a curse on Africans or black-skinned people. The curse is on Canaan, who in the biblical genealogies is the ancestor of the Canaanites, people who lived in the ancient Near East. The connection to Africa was invented wholesale by European interpreters who needed biblical veneer for what was really an economic and racial project. This misuse didn't just stay in bad theology. As late as 1994, the curse of Ham ideology contributed to the dehumanization that fueled the Rwandan genocide. A drunk man's irrational curse on his own innocent grandson became a weapon of mass suffering across centuries and continents. But Noah's post-flood behavior is just the appetizer. Let's talk about what happens when you actually read Genesis 10 and 11 side by side, which is something I genuinely encourage you to do if you never have. Genesis 10 is the so-called Table of Nations. It lists the descendants of Noah's 3 sons and describes how they spread out into different lands, each with their own tongues, by their clans, in their nations, their own tongues, multiple languages, different nations. That's Genesis 10, verse 5. Now turn the page. Genesis 11, verse 1 says, Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. Wait, what? Chapter 10 just told us that the descendants of Japheth, Gomer, and Javan had already dispersed with their own languages. Now chapter 11 says everyone on earth spoke the same language? This isn't a subtle tension. This is a flat contradiction sitting one chapter apart in the same book. The traditional defense? Augustine himself, one of the greatest theological minds in history, had to admit the text doesn't actually say this. You have to infer it charitably. That's a polite way of saying you have to ignore what it actually says. But there's a much simpler explanation, and it's the one that a young philosopher in 17th century Amsterdam arrived at, an explanation that nearly cost him his life. Baruch Spinoza was born in 1632 to a family of Portuguese Jewish immigrants in Amsterdam. He was brilliant, deeply educated in Jewish texts and philosophy, and by his early 20s, he'd reached a conclusion that would make him one of the most hated men in Europe. The Bible was not written by God. It wasn't even written by Moses. It was a human document, compiled from multiple sources, riddled with contradictions, and shaped by the political and cultural needs of the people who assembled it. On July 27, 1656, when Spinoza was just 23 years old, the leaders of the Talmud Torah community in Amsterdam issued a writ of herem against him, the most severe form of excommunication in Jewish law. The document condemned his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds, though it never specified exactly what those heresies were. It forbade anyone from communicating with him, standing within 6 feet of him, reading anything he'd written, or offering him any form of aid. He was, in the fullest social sense, erased. Then someone tried to kill him. Following the ban, a knife-wielding attacker confronted Spinoza outside the synagogue. He survived, but the message was clear. Spinoza left Amsterdam, left the Jewish community entirely, and spent the rest of his short life grinding lenses for a living, while writing some of the most revolutionary philosophy in Western history. His masterwork of biblical criticism, the Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, was published anonymously in late 1669 or early 1670. His contemporaries called it the most atheistic, blasphemous, and soul-destroying book ever written. Its stated aim was to liberate the individual from bondage to superstition and ecclesiastical authority. Spinoza saw what few others dared to acknowledge. Look at the flood itself. How long did it last? 40 days, according to Genesis 7:17. Or 150 days, according to Genesis 7:24. How many animals went on the ark? 1 pair of each, according to Genesis 6:19. Or 1 pair of unclean animals and 7 pairs of clean animals, according to Genesis 7:2. Did Noah release a raven, or a dove, or both? These aren't minor discrepancies. These are the kinds of contradictions that arise when 2 or more distinct accounts of the same event get woven together. Flood narratives appear throughout ancient literature. The oldest written flood story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its hero Utnapishtim, predates Genesis by centuries and shares striking parallels with Noah's account. Spinoza saw this clearly in the 1670s. By the 19th century, scholars had formally identified what Spinoza had seen 200 years earlier. The Bible wasn't one document. It was several, written by different people at different times, and then stitched together imperfectly. The seams show. The flood narrative is one of the most obvious ones. Spinoza got there first, and he got there alone. For Spinoza, there's no reason to expect that what the Bible says is either rational or true, any more so than what's expected from any other work of human literature. This was his core insight, and it terrified the authorities of his day precisely because it was so difficult to refute. He wasn't mocking the Bible, he was reading it. After the flood, the biblical lifespans don't just decline, they decline along a suspiciously perfect mathematical curve. 950 years for Noah, down to 600 for his son, down to 239 2 generations later, down to 70 by the time of King David. Someone constructed that pattern deliberately. The question isn't whether the math works. The question is whether any human being actually lived to be 950 years old, and on that question, archaeology, biology, and every other ancient civilization on Earth are completely silent. Before the flood, the ages are even more staggering. Adam lives to 930, Seth, 912. Methuselah holds the record at 969 years. These numbers come from the priestly source, one of the documents Spinoza identified, a source known for its love of genealogies, precise numbers, and ritual order. The priestly author wasn't recording history. He was constructing a theological architecture, one in which the pre-flood world was a kind of golden age that's been diminishing ever since. The irony in all of this is that Spinoza's work, the work that got him excommunicated, nearly assassinated, and banned from every major institution of his time, is now simply mainstream scholarship. The documentary hypothesis he pioneered gets taught in seminaries worldwide. Biblical scholars across the theological spectrum acknowledge multiple authorship of the Pentateuch. The contradictions Spinoza pointed out aren't controversial anymore. They're the starting point of serious study. Yet Spinoza himself remains unforgiven. His excommunication from the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam has never been rescinded. In 2015, the community came closer than ever to reconsidering the ban. The trustees of the Muhammad, the lay governing council, commissioned 4 leading scholars to write independent reports on the historical context of the harem. They sought opinions from Orthodox rabbis, including the community's senior Hakam, Rabbi Pinchas Toledano. Before a packed audience in early December 2015, the scholars presented their findings. Rabbi Toledano declined to lift the ban, citing Spinoza's preposterous ideas, where he was tearing apart the very fundamentals of our religion. In 2021, the echoes grew louder. Yitzhak Melamed, a professor of philosophy at Johns Hopkins University and a leading Spinoza scholar, was denied entry to the Amsterdam synagogue's library when he attempted to visit with a documentary film crew. More than 350 years after the original excommunication, a scholar of Spinoza's work was banned from the very building where the original ban was issued. Spinoza wrote something I think about often. He said they consider it pious not to trust their reason and their own judgment, and deem it impious to have doubts concerning the reliability of those who have handed down the sacred books to us. This is plain stupidity, not piety. He died on February 21, 1677, alone in The Hague, from tuberculosis, at the age of 44. He never married. He never held an academic position. He ground lenses until the glass dust destroyed his lungs. He left behind a body of work that fundamentally changed how human beings understand their most sacred texts. The post-flood narratives in Genesis aren't hidden. They're right there, in every Bible ever printed. A righteous man who gets drunk and curses his innocent grandson. A passage used to enslave millions. 2 consecutive chapters that flatly contradict each other about the number of languages on Earth. Lifespans that decline from 950 years to 70 along a suspiciously perfect mathematical curve. A flood story stitched together from at least 2 different sources with incompatible details about its most basic facts. The Church doesn't pretend these passages aren't there. It does something more effective. It simply never reads them out loud. Spinoza read them out loud. Nearly 4 centuries later, the punishment still stands. The question Spinoza asked, who decides what's true, was already being answered centuries before he was born. In 664, a king answered it at the Synod of Whitby. That video is next.